So now that we can add the data, edit the data, we need to make a function to read any particular data, so any user's data. So in our data CSV file, we would be able to go in here and pick a user by their email or an ID. So we've already kind of covered the basics of this on reading the data or how we can read the data. And we've already covered a little bit of the logic on the edit portion. So it's actually very similar to this, but instead of editing it, we're just going to return that information. So above everything, we're going to make a new function here, and we're going to call it define read data. And it's going to take a user ID of none and an email of none. So user ID, of course, being one of these IDs here. You could use the keyword argument of ID, but ID is something that is in Python too, so I'm just going to stick with user underscore ID. Now, just like we normally do, we're going to open up the actual file. So let's go ahead and grab the file name. And then I'm going to say with open file name, and of course it's R and as CSV file. So basically very similar to this, but the reader is not just going to be a reader. Instead, it's going to be the dictionary reader. So we'll do reader equals to CSV dot dict reader and the CSV file. And then we'll say items equals to an empty list. And let's now iterate through the reader items. So for row in reader, we are going to say if user ID underscore ID is not none, then we're going to check something out. So I'll just say pass for now. I'm going to explain this. And then we'll say if email is not none, then we're also going to pass here. So right here, you don't have to do is not none. You could just literally say if email. But saying if not is not none is very verbose, because you could also set a default here if you wanted to and pass none or not even pass anything in there. So that's the reason that putting is not none is a good idea, because if you change these parameters whatsoever. Okay, cool. So now that I've got this, I have pretty much all of the information that I need to actually run through this, right? So we've got our user ID name, and we're running through the row. So we'll say if the integer of user ID is equal to the integer of the row, and if you remember, we have to use the dictionary value, and we'll do get ID, and basically we're going to return this row, right? That's what we'll do for now. And right here, this another call here could be if the row and using the brackets of ID. This will basically say for sure there's a column called ID, which is actually not the case because that first row doesn't actually have that. So we're going to go ahead and use get. So of course we can do this exact same thing for email, and just come in here and say if email, and this time it's no longer a string or an integer, or excuse me, it's no longer an integer, it's going to be a string, but we can just completely remove it. So that's it. That's the function to read our data. So let's go ahead and copy this, and I'm going to bring it into our Python 3 file. So I'll do Python 3, and I'll paste this read data in, and I'll say read data and user ID equals to 1, press enter, and we got no CSV installed. So let's actually go ahead and import that, try that one more time, and there we go. And if I change this to being like 3, it does that as well. If I go into the CSV file and actually change it to being something else, like John and ABC and whatever, I can actually do that. So that was ID of 5. Oops. Let's try that again. ID of 5, press enter, and it will actually bring back that specific information. That's great. So there is something that I want to do though, is if the user ID or the email are not found, then I want to indicate that, right? So like basically say, hey, this item wasn't found, but I don't want to necessarily break everything. So it's really simple here. All we could do is say else equals to, well, I'll just say unknown user ID equals to the user ID. And then down here, we'll say else equals to unknown email equals to email. Right, so the reason that I can write these variables in here is because the email is not none. There's actually a value for it. So now that we have unknown email or unknown user ID, we can use those. Before we do that, let's actually put them up here just because we're not always going to have unknown email or unknown user ID, so we actually have to declare them before we set them, in this case, because of the if statements and all that. And then finally, after that for loop is done, we can say if unknown user ID is not none, again, for the same reason, we can return the string of user ID not found, and I'm going to say user ID with the format of user ID not found, and then we'll just do dot format, and we'll put user ID equals to the user ID. All right, so we can copy this virtually and put it down here and just say email. Let's change everything to email, because that will be the other lookup that we're doing. So user underscore email is not none. And then finally, we're going to return none. Actually, we don't need that because we have all the return statements available basically, unless we have nothing here. So if it's really just nothing, after the with statement, we'll just return none. So that's where we'll have return. So every sort of return statement's in there. So if you want to think about the return statements here, this if statement says it's going to return something, or it's going to return that it doesn't know that user ID. This statement says it's going to return something, or it's going to set the unknown email. And then on those two things, it will return something. The only time it wouldn't return anything is if these two were blank completely. And in that case, we're just going to run a return of none. Okay, so let's go ahead and copy this in, paste it in here, and we're going to read data. This time I'm going to say user ID equals to like some random number, and now I give this user ID not found. And of course you can say the exact same thing for email, and you could use literally the same stuff. And we get the email part not being found as well. Cool, so that's all we really need to do for reading the data. So now we can read, write, and edit the data. We don't exactly have a delete function, right? So we don't have a way to delete a row at this point, but I would challenge you to actually do that on your own with this edit data function. It's actually really not that challenging, but it is something that you should think about doing if it is something that you would want to do. I'm going to leave it out because I don't think it's that necessary for what we're building, because also you could, if you really wanted to, you could just come in here and delete any particular item inside of the CSV file itself. But now that we've got this function ready for read data, it's time to actually start making this just a little bit more dynamic and being able to call it from our command line. So that's what we'll do tomorrow. Thanks for watching. Let us know if you have any questions. Otherwise, we'll see you later.